The cold blast of October wind whipped through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876. But it was nothing compared to the chill Mabel Sutton felt as the shopkeeper shoved her change across the counter, careful to avoid touching her hands. She quickly pocketed the coins, tugging her worn gloves back on before anyone else could stare. But it was too late. The whispers had already started. "Did you see those hands?" a woman murmured behind her fan, "more fit for a mine mule than a lady." Mabel kept her head high as she gathered her purchases. At 22, she'd heard it all before. Her hands calloused, scarred, with bent fingers that hadn't healed right after the mining accident 3 years prior, were a source of constant ridicule in a town that valued women for their delicacy and grace. "Miss Sutton," Mrs. Holloway, the milliner's wife, called out as Mabel passed. "Perhaps you'd like to purchase some new gloves. I've some sturdy ones that might accommodate your condition." Mabel forced a smile. "No thank you, Mrs. Holloway, these serve me fine." She hurried away, blinking back tears that threatened to spill. The basket of supplies grew heavy as she made her way to the edge of town where her small cabin sat near the creek. The sound of hoofbeats made her step aside, pressing against the boardwalk as a group of riders thundered past. One horse pulled up short and Mabel glanced up to see Griffin Quinn, foreman of the nearby Quarter Circle Ranch, tipping his hat. "Afternoon, Miss Sutton," he said, his voice carrying a hint of the South that 3 years in Wyoming Territory hadn't erased. "Those supplies look mighty heavy." Mabel shifted the basket to her hip. "I can manage, Mr. Quinn." Griffin dismounted in one fluid motion, his tall frame casting a shadow across her. "Never doubted that for a second," he smiled, the corner of his eyes crinkling. At 28, he had earned both the respect of the cowhands and the admiring glances of every unmarried woman in 3 counties. "But my mama raised me better than to ride past a lady struggling with her parcels." Before she could protest, he had taken the basket, his fingers brushing against hers. She quickly pulled her hands back, tucking them into the folds of her skirt. If he noticed, he made no mention of it. "I can walk you home," he offered. "Caesar here could use the exercise anyway." He patted his chestnut gelding's neck. Mabel hesitated. "Your men will be waiting." "Let them wait." Griffin's hazel eyes met hers. "The cattle drive is over, winter preparations nearly complete. We've earned a slow day." They walked in silence for several minutes, the horses' hooves clopping softly on the packed dirt road. Mabel was acutely aware of every step, every breath. Griffin Quinn had always been polite when their paths crossed, but they'd never spent more than a few minutes in conversation. "Your brother's still working at the Blackwater mine?" he asked eventually. Mabel nodded. "Matthew's the foreman now. Good man, helped us when that wolf pack was going after calves last spring." Griffin glanced at her. "You both came from Pennsylvania, right, after your parents passed?" 4 years ago. Matthew thought there'd be opportunities out west." She didn't mention how their dreams of fortune had crumbled when the mining accident left her hands mangled and her prospects for marriage all but vanished. They reached the small cabin Matthew had built near the creek. It wasn't much, but it had a sturdy roof and thick walls to keep out the Wyoming winter that loomed just weeks away. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn," Mabel said, reaching for her basket. Griffin handed it over, but his gaze lingered on her gloved hands. "You know, Miss Sutton, I've been meaning to ask if you might be interested in a position at the ranch." Mabel stiffened. "I don't need charity, Mr. Quinn." "It ain't charity I'm offering." He leaned against his saddle. "Mrs. Winters, our cook, is getting on in years. Her eyes aren't what they used to be, and she's having trouble with the mending and such. The men's shirts are looking more like sieves than proper clothing." He smiled. "I heard from Mrs. Peterson at church that you're the finest seamstress in the territory." Mabel looked away. "I manage well enough. Better than well enough, from what I hear. We need someone with skilled hands." At this, she couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "You've clearly not heard everything about me then, Mr. Quinn." Griffin's expression remained steady. "I've heard that you can mend tears so fine they disappear." That you can embroider detail work that puts the ladies in Denver to shame, that you took in every seam of the pastor's wife's Sunday dress after she lost weight from that fever last winter. He stepped closer. I don't give a damn what your hands look like, Miss Sutton. I care what they can do. For a moment, Mabel couldn't speak, caught between hope and suspicion. The ranch is 5 miles out. We'd provide room and board, good pay too, $3 a week. It was more than generous. Mabel's occasional mending work barely brought in half that amount. I'd need to discuss it with my brother, she said finally. Griffin nodded. Of course, I'll call again tomorrow for your answer. He mounted his horse with easy grace. Good day, Miss Sutton. Mabel watched him ride away, her mind racing. A position at quarter circle would mean security, steady work. But it would also mean living among strangers who would stare and whisper. She wasn't sure her pride could weather it. That evening, when Matthew returned from the mine, his face gray with coal dust but his eyes bright with news, she told him about Griffin's offer. You should take it, Matthew said immediately, washing his hands in the basin. Quinn runs a good outfit, treats his people fair. But my hands, what about them? Matthew's voice was sharp. They work, don't they? Better than most folks with pretty, unmarred hands. Mabel looked down at her gloves, which she rarely removed even at home. People talk, Matthew. People always talk. He dried his hands and sat beside her at their small table. Mabel, you can't hide away forever, and I worry about leaving you alone so much, the mine's pushing us deeper, meaning longer shifts. He took her hands in his. You've got a gift. Don't waste it because some small-minded folks can't see past appearances. The next day, Mabel was waiting on the porch when Griffin rode up. His face brightened when he saw her small trunk beside her. I take it that's a yes, he called, dismounting. Mabel nodded, willing her voice to remain steady. On a trial basis, if it doesn't work out, it will. Griffin loaded her trunk onto the wagon he'd brought. Mrs. Winters is beside herself with excitement, said it'll be nice having another woman around the place. The ride to Quarter Circle Ranch passed more quickly than Mabel expected, with Griffin pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the land. The ranch itself was impressive, a sprawling main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings spread across a valley with mountains rising in the distance. Mrs. Winters, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, welcomed Mabel warmly. Thank the Lord you're here, girl. These cowboys go through clothes faster than a prairie fire through dry grass. She showed Mabel to a small but comfortable room off the kitchen. It ain't much, but it's private. It's perfect, Mabel said, genuinely pleased. It was larger than her room at the cabin, with a real bed instead of a straw pallet and a window that looked out onto a small garden. The first week was a flurry of activity as Mabel established her routine. Mornings were spent helping Mrs. Winters with breakfast for the ranch hands. Afterward, she'd settle by the window in the main house's sitting room with her mending basket. The work was plentiful but satisfying: torn shirts, split seams, buttons to replace. She kept her gloves on most of the time, but the fine needlework required bare fingers. When the ranch hands were out working and Mrs. Winters was busy in the kitchen, Mabel would remove them, working quickly with her scarred hands. One afternoon, as she was embroidering the ranch's brand onto a new set of handkerchiefs Griffin had requested, the door opened unexpectedly. She looked up to find him standing there, his hat in his hands. Miss Sutton, I was wondering if he stopped, his eyes falling to her bare hands. Mabel froze, then quickly reached for her gloves. No, Griffin said softly. Please don't. She hesitated, her hands hovering over the gloves. No one besides Matthew and the doctor had seen her hands bare in years. I didn't mean to startle you, Griffin said, taking a step forward. I just never see you without those gloves. Mabel's throat tightened. There's good reason for that, Mr. Quinn. Griffin sat in the chair opposite her, his gaze steady. May I? He reached out, palm up. Mabel's heart hammered in her chest. Slowly, reluctantly, she placed her right hand in his, bracing for the grimace of disgust that was sure to follow. His expression didn't change as he studied her hand, the scarred palm, the crooked ring finger that hadn't set properly, the rough calluses. His thumb traced a scar that ran across her palm. "The accident at the mine," he said quietly. "Matthew mentioned it once." Mabel nodded, unable to speak. "You were there, helping in the office," she explained. "There was a collapse. I was trapped under a beam. The doctor said I was lucky to keep all my fingers." Griffin's hand enveloped hers gently. "These are good hands, Miss Sutton, strong hands." Tears pricked at her eyes. "They're ugly." "No," he said firmly. "They're hands that have faced hardship and survived. That's not ugly. That's beautiful." For the first time in years, Mabel didn't immediately pull away from someone touching her bare hands. Instead, she found herself studying Griffin's face, the sincerity in his hazel eyes, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows. The moment was broken by Mrs. Winters calling from the kitchen. Griffin released her hand and stood. "I actually came to ask if you'd join me for a ride tomorrow. There's a spot on the ranch I'd like to show you, if you're interested." Mabel hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." The next afternoon, Griffin had 2 horses saddled and waiting. "Ever ridden before?" he asked as he helped her mount a gentle mare. "Not since I was a girl in Pennsylvania," Mabel admitted, gripping the reins uncertainly. "Daisy here will take good care of you," Griffin assured her, swinging up onto his own mount. "She knows these trails better than I do." They rode at an easy pace, moving away from the ranch buildings and into the rolling grasslands. Griffin pointed out features of the landscape, telling her the history of the ranch, how his uncle had started it 20 years earlier and left it to Griffin when he passed 3 years ago. "I came out from Virginia after the war," he explained. "Didn't have much waiting for me back home. Uncle needed help and I needed a fresh start." "The war changed many things," Mabel said quietly. Griffin nodded. "Some for the worse, some for the better, taught me to value what truly matters." He led them through a stand of cottonwoods to a small rise overlooking a creek. "Here we are," Mabel gasped. The view was spectacular: mountains in the distance, the creek winding through green pasture where cattle grazed peacefully. Wildflowers still bloomed in patches despite the lateness of the season. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Griffin helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch. When things get too hectic, I come here to remind myself why I do what I do." They sat on a fallen log, watching the play of sunlight on the water. Griffin seemed content with the silence, but Mabel found herself wanting to know more about him. "Do you have family back in Virginia?" she asked. "Parents died in '62. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Had a younger brother, but he fell at Gettysburg." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Mabel could hear the old pain beneath the words. "Uncle Jacob was my mother's brother. Wrote to me after the war, said he had more land than he knew what to do with and could use a pair of strong hands." "I'm sorry about your family," Mabel said softly. Griffin turned to her with a small smile. "Found a new one here. The hands, Mrs. Winters. We're a mismatched bunch, but we look after each other." He paused. "Hope you might consider yourself part of it too." The weeks passed, and Mabel found herself settling into life at Quarter Circle Ranch. The Cowboys, initially awkward around her, soon became comfortable enough to joke and tease. Mrs. Winters treated her like a daughter, teaching her ranch recipes and telling stories of the early days of the territory. And then there was Griffin. They fell into a pattern of evening walks after supper when the day's work was done. Sometimes they'd talk about books. Griffin had a small but cherished library in his study, or about their childhoods, their dreams. Other times they'd walk in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in spectacular colors. Mabel found herself looking forward to these walks more than anything else. Somewhere along the way, she'd started removing her gloves around Griffin without thinking about it. November brought the first heavy snow, transforming the ranch into a wonderland of white. Work slowed as the cattle were moved to sheltered pastures and the ranch prepared for the long winter ahead. The evenings grew longer, often spent gathered around the fireplace in the main house. One such evening, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Winters to her room, Mabel sat with Griffin playing checkers. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across the room. "You're getting better," Griffin commented as she captured one of his pieces. "Soon I'll have no excuses for losing," Mabel laughed. "You never make excuses when you lose. One of my few virtues." His smile made her heart skip. "Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask you something." There was something in his tone that made her look up sharply. "The Christmas dance in town is coming up in 3 weeks," he said, his eyes on the checkerboard. "I was hoping you might accompany me." Mabel's breath caught. The annual Christmas dance was the social event of the year in Silver Creek. Everyone would be there. Everyone would see. "I don't dance," she said automatically. Griffin's gaze met hers. "Neither do I, if truth be told. 2 left feet, according to my mother, but I'd still like to take you. People will talk. Let them." He reached across the table and took her hands, her bare, scarred hands. "Mabel, I don't give a damn what anyone in that town thinks. I care what you think, about me." The air between them seemed to still, heavy with unspoken words. Mabel looked at their joined hands, then back at his face. "I think you're a good man, Griffin Quinn," she said softly. "The best I've known." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "And I think you're the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever met." Mabel shook her head, unable to believe his words. "You can't, I can, and I do." Griffin's voice was firm. "Mabel Sutton, I've been half in love with you since that day I walked you home. These past months have only confirmed what I suspected then, that you're someone special. Someone I want to build a life with." Tears filled her eyes. "My hands are perfect," he interrupted, "because they're yours." He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to each palm. "These hands are strong enough to build a life with me, if you're willing." The day of the Christmas dance arrived with clear skies and fresh snow. Mabel stood in front of the small mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back. Mrs. Winters had helped her alter one of her old gowns, deep green velvet with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Winters said, adjusting the collar. "That color brings out your eyes something wonderful." Mabel smoothed the fabric nervously. "I haven't been to a dance since before the accident." Mrs. Winters squeezed her shoulder. "High time you went then, and with a fine man like Mr. Quinn at your side." When Mabel descended the stairs, Griffin was waiting in the front hall. He stared at her with such open admiration that her cheeks flushed warm. "You are a vision, Mabel Sutton," he said, offering his arm. The ride to town in the sleigh, bundled under thick buffalo robes with hot bricks at their feet, was magical. Stars glittered overhead in the cold, clear night. Griffin's shoulder pressed against hers, warm and solid. As they approached the town hall where the dance was being held, Mabel's anxiety returned. She reached for her gloves. Griffin's hand caught hers. "You don't need those. Griffin, everyone will see, let them see." He turned to face her fully. "Mabel, I'm proud to be escorting the most beautiful, talented woman in the territory. If anyone has a problem with your hands, they'll answer to me." The determination in his eyes gave her courage. She left the gloves in her pocket. They entered the hall to the sounds of fiddles and laughter. The room was festooned with pine boughs and red ribbons, lanterns casting a golden glow over the proceedings. Heads turned as they walked in, whispers following in their wake. Mrs. Holloway, the milliner's wife who had offered Mabel accommodating gloves, approached with a tight smile. "Mr. Quinn, Miss Sutton, how unexpected to see you here." "Mrs. Holloway," Griffin nodded politely, "Mabel and I wouldn't miss the Christmas dance for the world." The woman's eyes dropped to Mabel's bare hands. "How brave of you, dear," she said with false sweetness. Before Mabel could respond, Griffin spoke. "Brave isn't the word I'd use, madam. I'd say it's honest. Mabel has nothing to hide and everything to be proud of." He placed his hand at the small of Mabel's back. "If you'll excuse us, I believe this is our dance." He led her away, leaving Mrs. Holloway sputtering behind them. On the dance floor, Mabel hesitated. I told you I don't know how to dance, she whispered. Griffin grinned. Lucky for you, neither do I. We'll figure it out together. And they did. Awkwardly at first, stepping on each other's toes and laughing, then with growing confidence as they found their rhythm. Griffin kept her close, his hand warm against hers, his eyes never leaving her face. See, not so terrible, he murmured. For the first time in years, Mabel felt truly seen, not for her scars or her differences, but for herself. The stares and whispers that had once cut so deeply now seemed to fade into insignificance beside the way Griffin looked at her. As the night wore on, others approached them, some genuinely welcoming, others merely curious. Matthew arrived from the mine and beamed to see his sister dancing and smiling. Mrs. Peterson, who had always been kind, made a point of admiring the embroidery Mabel had added to her dress cuffs. Such fine work, she said, examining the stitches closely. Those are gifted hands you have, my dear. During a break in the music, Griffin led her outside to the small porch behind the hall. The night air was crisp, their breath forming clouds in the moonlight. Are you cold? He asked, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Mabel shook her head. I'm perfect. And for the first time in years, she meant it. Griffin turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Mabel, there's something I need to say. Her heart quickened. Yes, I love you. His voice was clear and certain. I love your strength, your kindness, your talent. I love the way you hum when you're sewing and don't think anyone can hear. I love how you always save a piece of pie for old Tom because you know it's his favorite. He lifted her hands to his heart. And I love these hands, these beautiful, capable hands that create such wonderful things. Tears filled her eyes. Griffin, I don't expect an answer tonight, he continued, but I want you to know that when you're ready, if you'll have me, I want to make a life with you. A home, a family. He smiled softly. You don't have to say anything now, just know that's where my heart stands. Mabel looked at their joined hands, his strong and tanned, her scarred and bent, and felt a surge of courage. I love you too, she whispered. I've been afraid to admit it, afraid to hope for things I thought I could never have. But you make me brave, Griffin Quinn. His smile could have lit the night. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a gentle, perfect kiss. When they returned to the dance floor, Mabel no longer noticed the stares or whispers. All she could see was Griffin, his eyes full of promise and tomorrow. Spring came early to Wyoming Territory in 1877. The snow melted, revealing tender green shoots and colorful wildflowers across the ranch lands. Mabel stood on the porch of the main house, watching as riders moved the cattle to the higher pastures for summer grazing. She no longer lived in the small room off the kitchen. Instead, she had moved into the main house 3 months earlier, after a small wedding ceremony attended by the ranch hands, Mrs. Winters and Matthew. The gold band on her finger caught the morning sunlight. Strong arms encircled her from behind, and she leaned back into her husband's embrace. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Quinn, Griffin murmured against her hair. Mabel smiled. Just thinking how much has changed in a year. For the better, I hope. She turned in his arms, for the very best. Griffin caught her hands, pressing a kiss to each palm as he'd done that first night he declared his feelings. These hands, he said softly, hold my entire world. Mabel no longer flinched when he touched her scars. Instead, she cupped his face with her imperfect hands and drew him down for a kiss. Later that day, as she sat on their favorite ridge overlooking the creek, her sewing basket beside her and Griffin's head in her lap, Mabel reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The accident that had seemed like the end of her dreams had ultimately led her to this place, this man, this life filled with love and purpose. Griffin opened his eyes, smiling up at her. What are you thinking about now? Mabel ran her fingers through his hair, her wedding band glinting in the sunlight. How sometimes what we think are our greatest weaknesses turn out to be our greatest strengths. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Those hands saved me, you know. I was just existing before you came along. Now I'm living. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. Mabel knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world not in spite of her hands, but because of them, and because of the man who had seen their beauty when no one else could.